When we open Illustrator for the first time, what we need to understand is what this tool is used for. This software is great at producing illustrative type images, and we need to think about the fact that Illustrator is a really good tracing tool. It relies on the idea that you can build up quite complicated shapes, but each of the shapes can be constantly re-edited and tweaked. It's not like Photoshop, where if you work in one layer and you make modifications to that area, you can only start changing individual bits if you select those and copy them. One of the significant things about Illustrator is that it tries to make the purpose of producing illustrations easier. So there are a series of things that are already set up for you. So for instance, if I go to the rectangular marquee tool, I can select a rectangle. Now when I select a rectangle and I pull it into shape, I have a series of different things that I can do with that rectangle. So one of those is I can modify the outline. Now we call the outline the stroke. So you can see up here it says stroke, and if I change that value to a smaller value, you can see that automatically that shape has its stroke changed. So I can change that from, a very, very fine stroke indeed to obviously a much thicker one. And I have the ability obviously to tweak the thickness of that line by using the up and down arrows. This outline shape here you'll also see down here. So up here and over here, this is the stroke colour. So if I click on here, I've got a series of presets, and I can obviously change that colour according to those presets, or I can come down here, click on that, and then, like Photoshop, I've got a much wider choice of hues in terms of tonality, saturation, etc. When I create this rectangle, I've also filled this rectangle with colour. This up here is the fill colour, and you'll see it also here. So if I click on that shape, then obviously I've filled this shape with that colour. Again, down here, I can modify that fill colour to something different. So in terms of the creation of shapes, any shape that I can create, I can fill it with any colour, and I'm always able to edit that shape again. Now, if I click outside of that rectangle, this dialog box pops up, and if I go OK, then what I've just created is an identical version of the shape that I've just made. If I click again outside of that space, nothing happens because I've created a new one. So basically, Illustrator is thinking, oh, you've just created this shape, would you like some more? Now I can select that shape and I can move that shape. And when I move that shape, you can see that Illustrator says, oh, you're in line with this shape now. I'm going to give you a little indication that you're in line. You can see that little line popping up. So for instance, when my centers meet. Obviously, a bit like Photoshop, I can select all of those shapes and I can resize them. And again, you can see that everything is resizing at the same time. I can move the shapes around. I can move them quite carefully using the arrow keys on my keyboard. So if we look underneath Illustrator, we can see that we can create a rectangle, but we also have some other options as well. So I'm just going to select all of those for the minute and hit backspace to delete. If I come down to the ellipse tool, and clearly I create an ellipse. Now of course at the moment down here I've got a fill and a stroke already selected. So I could set that back to black. I could set the inside to white, and I could reduce down the stroke colour and width. Once I've created an ellipse, obviously if I go to the elliptical tool and hold the shift key down, just like Photoshop, I'm going to create a perfect circle. I select all of those for the moment and delete those. If I come down further underneath here, I've got the polygonal tool. And when I click on the polygonal tool, what it's asking me for is how many sides of a polygon do I want. So obviously if I bring this down to 3 and go OK, I've created a triangle. I can hold my mouse down and pull that triangle out, and you can see this is an equilateral triangle. Once I've pulled that out, obviously I can use up here the move tools or the selection tools, and I can now start to sort of change the shape of this. So if I'm holding this in the middle, you can see I can start to change the proportions of that triangle. If I come outside of that image, I can rotate that triangle. When this shape is selected, you may have also seen this little dot appear. And if I use my selection tool, I can hold my mouse on that point and I can start to pull that from a pointed triangle into a curved triangle. I go Command and Z for the moment. If I do this with the direct selection tool, then you can see I've now got 3 points. So that means that I could select this corner, around this one off, or just click on that one shape. And then I'm just going to modify that particular apex. If I come down to the polygonal tool and click again and change that from 3 points to 5 points, I'll create a pentagram. And again, I can start to change the shape of that pentagram. So I can modify the corners, but also if I use the direct selection tool and click on a point, we call these the anchor points, I can now start to move that anchor point individually. So by clicking on an anchor point, I can start to change or modify the shape into something more or less what I'm after. Obviously we can create shapes, so we can create different shapes. And when we've created different shapes, we can start to join those shapes or remove those shapes from each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just select all of those for the moment. I'm just going to move all of them into frame. And what we have is a very useful tool called the Shape Builder tool. Now when we hit the Shape Builder tool and we hover over these shapes, what we can start to do is we can start to add or subtract these shapes together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out this shape from this pentagram. So if I hover over this space, you can see that the arrow pops up with a plus sign. If I hold my Alt key down, you can see it becomes a minus sign. So I can now take that shape away from this one. If I hold my mouse, hold my Alt key down and then draw through these shapes, you can now see that I've created a single shape. And again, I can now modify that particular shape. Again, if I go to the direct selection tool, I can individually click on an anchor point and then change my anchor points. So the first thing to think about then is that you can build shapes. You can build shapes by using the rectangle tool. You can use the polygonal tool to create different kinds of shapes. And you can kind of modify those shapes once you've made them with the use of the selection tool and the direct selection tool.